190 years ago today, in 1832, November 24th, South Carolina passed the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring that the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 were null and void in the state, beginning the Nullification Crisis. Gobble gobble! Welcome to Novelty Don's History. Hope you had a great supper. Here's Spoonie with what the Ordinance of Nullification is.
Hope that pumpkin pie wasn't too much. The Ordinance of Nullification declared the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void within the borders of the U.S. state of South Carolina, beginning on February 1, 1833. It began the Nullification Crisis. Passed by a state convention on November 24, 1832, it led to President Andrew Jackson's proclamation against South Carolina, the Nullification Proclamation on December 10, 1832, which threatened to send government ground troops to enforce the tariffs. In the face of the military threat, and following a congressional revision of the law which lowered the tariff, South Carolina repealed the ordinance. The protest that led to the Ordinance of Nullification was caused by the belief that the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 favored the North over the South and therefore violated the Constitution. This led to an emphasis on the differences between the two regions and helped set the stage for conflict during the antebellum era, eventually leading to the American Civil War. Nano.
That was the Ordinance of Nullification, read by Spoonie. Next up is the Tariff Act of 1828. This was a good idea in theory. The execution was horrible. Basically, they tried to pass a bill that made American jobs more important. However, the way they wrote the bill made it very hard for normal people to buy everyday goods. Here's Spoonie.
Spoonie's back. The Tariff of 1828 was a very high protective tariff that became law in the United States in May 1828. It was a bill designed to not pass Congress because it was seen by free trade supporters as hurting both industry and farming, but surprisingly, it passed. The bill was vehemently denounced in the South and escalated to a threat of civil war in the Nullification Crisis of 1832 to 1833. The tariff was replaced in 1833, and the crisis ended. It was called the Tariff of Abominations by its Southern detractors because of the effects it had on the Southern economy. It set a 38% tax on some imported goods and a 45% tax on certain imported raw materials. The manufacturing-based economy in the northeastern states was suffering from low-priced imported manufactured items from Britain. The major goal of the tariff was to protect the factories by taxing imports from Europe. Southerners from the Cotton Belt, particularly those from South Carolina, felt they were harmed directly by having to pay more for imports from Europe. Allegedly, the South was also harmed indirectly because reducing the exportation of British goods to the U.S. would make it difficult for the British to pay for the cotton they imported from the South. The reaction in the South, particularly in South Carolina, led to the Nullification Crisis. Gobble gobble.
Thank you, Spoonie. Next up is the Nullification Crisis. After Spoonie reads you the Cliff Notes, I'll explain why I chose this moment in history. Dankeschön.
Here we go again. The Nullification Crisis was a United States sectional political crisis in 1832-33, during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, which involved a confrontation between the state of South Carolina and the federal government. It ensued after South Carolina declared the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 unconstitutional and therefore null and void within the sovereign boundaries of the state. However, courts at the state and federal level, including the U.S. Supreme Court, repeatedly have rejected the theory of nullification by states. The controversial and highly protective Tariff of 1828 was enacted into law during the presidency of John Quincy Adams. The tariff was strongly opposed in the South, since it was perceived to put an unfair tax burden on the southern agrarian states that imported most manufactured goods. The tariff's opponents expected that Jackson's election as president would result in a significant reduction of it. When the Jackson administration failed to take any action to address their concerns, South Carolina's most radical faction began to advocate that the state declare the tariff null and void within the state. In Washington, an open split on the issue occurred between Jackson and Vice President John C. Calhoun, a native South Carolinian and the most effective proponent of the constitutional theory of state nullification, the legal theory that if a state believed a federal law unconstitutional, it could declare the law null and void in the state. This legal theory has been rejected at state and federal level. On July 1, 1832, before Calhoun resigned the vice presidency to run for the Senate, where he could more effectively defend nullification, Jackson signed into law the Tariff of 1832. This compromise tariff received the support of most Northerners and half the Southerners in Congress. But it did not satisfy South Carolina, and on November 24, 1832, A state convention adopted the Ordinance of Nullification, which declared that the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 were unconstitutional and unenforceable in South Carolina after February 1, 1833. South Carolina initiated military preparations to resist anticipated federal enforcement, but on March 1, 1833, Congress passed both the Force Bill, authorizing the President to use military forces against South Carolina, and a new negotiated tariff, the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which was satisfactory to South Carolina. The South Carolina Convention reconvened and repealed its nullification ordinance on March 15, 1833, but 3 days later, nullified the Force Bill as a symbolic gesture of principle. The crisis was over, and both sides found reasons to claim victory. The tariff rates were reduced and stayed low to the satisfaction of the South, but the states' rights doctrine of nullification remained controversial. By the 1850s, the issues of the expansion of slavery into the Western territories and the threat of the slave power became the central issues in the nation. Enjoy your night, Nano Nano.
Nanu Nanu. The reason I chose this topic is to show good intentions can lead to poor execution. The main reason, however, is the following. This was the start of the Civil War. If we as Americans and people came together before making Americans take sides, the Civil War may have not happened. So please learn to keep trying peaceful actions and you will have better success. This has been Nobly with your moment in history. Please like and subscribe. Have a great Thanksgiving with your family.
Manja manja.